in John 1, verse 3, it says, all things were made through him, that's Jesus, and without him was not anything made that was made. And I remember reading that verse in a primary school presentation, and to a kind of 10-year-old Dan, it was absolutely baffling as to what it meant. But thankfully now I understand it much better. It was basically saying that in the beginning, everything that was created through Jesus. And so here in the boat, Jesus demonstrates to his disciples his complete authority over creation by rebuking the winds and the waves, and they have to obey his voice. And there's some really interesting parallels between the storm in Luke and the storm in the book of Jonah. Both Jonah and Jesus are asleep in their respective boats when the storms hit them. But the two storms seem to have arisen for two very different reasons. So in Jonah, it seems really clear that God sent the storm. And he sent the storm because of Jonah's disobedience. So God was using the storm to bring Jonah to a place of repentance and to get him back on track, to kind of get him back on a path of obedience. And yet here the storm in the book of Luke has arisen around the disciples despite their obedience. So it was Jesus who said, let's get into a boat at the start. And so the disciples really were just obeying his voice and doing what he had asked them to do, which I think is really interesting because from my experience, when storms kind of arise in my life, the first question I ask myself is, what have I done wrong? Where am I going wrong? What's God trying to teach me here? Where have I been disobedient? And yet the storm in Luke has arisen around the disciples, despite the fact that they were just obeying Jesus's voice. They weren't being disobedient at all. But regardless, Jesus was going to use this storm to reveal more of himself to his disciples. So I don't know from looking at the account kind of what the reasons for the storm were. I don't know whether God sent the storm that kind of came on the boat and the disciples. I don't know whether it was an enemy that sent the storm to try and hinder Jesus's plans and purposes, or it could have just been a completely natural occurrence because the lake, I think, was prone to those kind of storms. So it could have just been completely natural. But in some ways, I don't think it matters at all what the kind of cause of the storm was. Jesus was going to use this storm for his glory and for the benefit of his disciples. He wanted to show his disciples that he had authority over nature. He had authority to speak to the wind and the waves, and they had to obey his voice. And he had the ability to change their circumstances and bring peace to the panic and the chaos that was going on inside their hearts. And it would have been an amazing lesson for the disciples to learn. And I've always struggled a little bit with Jesus's response to the disciples in verse 25, where he says, "Where is your faith?" And it's almost like he's saying, why did you wake me up? Could you not have just trusted that everything was going to be okay? Just ride out the storm. In the end, it was all going to be okay. And yet, I don't think that is at all what Jesus is saying with that response to them. I think the disciples were absolutely right to cry out to Jesus, but they didn't know who they were crying out to. They were crying out in despair. They weren't crying out in faith to somebody that they knew could help them in this situation. They thought all hope was lost. They thought they were dying. They thought they were perishing. They thought the situation was too big for Jesus. That's why he's saying, where is your faith? So they were right to cry out to him, but they didn't know who he was. So in some ways, I think the disciples really needed this storm. They really needed a revelation of who Jesus was, that he was the one who had authority over nature. He had authority over their circumstances. And I think we need the same revelation sometimes, don't we? That Jesus has, as we've heard already, has all power and authority in our circumstances, and that he cares for us, that he's close to us. And then when we cry out in faith to him, that he can help us, he can calm the storms and bring peace to the chaos in our hearts. And that is the one that is in the boat, that he is the one who is in the boat with us, the Jesus who has authority over nature. So that was kind of the first revelation in the first encounter for his disciples. Jesus has authority over nature. And then having calmed the storm, they land on the other side of the lake. And we get, in verse 27, it says that Jesus is met by a man who has demons. And the passage kind of goes into some detail about how bad his condition is. And it's interesting, I think, that it wasn't actually Jesus, it doesn't seem to be anyway, Jesus that is seeking this man out. It's the man that finds Jesus. There's something in this man that is drawn towards Jesus, despite the helplessness of his situation. It seems from the account that he doesn't have a huge amount of control over what he does. And yet something in this man was drawn to Jesus, and he finds himself in this encounter with Jesus. And as the encounter unfolds, it becomes apparent just how bad this man's situation was, because he didn't just have one demon, he had lots of demons. And when Jesus asks for his name, he responds with the name Legion, which I'm sure many of us will know is a kind of Roman military term, which is describing a collection of between 4,000 and 6,000 soldiers in the Roman army. And so I don't know whether that is necessarily an accurate number of how many demons were in this man, but regardless, it was definitely lots. This man had lots of demons in him. The Bible's quite clear on that. And to the disciples who were watching this encounter unfold, that probably would have been really intimidating for them. You know, that this wasn't just a one-on-one encounter. This was Jesus and a whole legion of demons, and they would have felt, probably watching it, that Jesus was on the back foot, that he had a disadvantage in this encounter. And yet it's quite clear from the account that the demons knew that Jesus was in complete authority over them. And he casts, when he says they're to leave, they have to obey his voice. And so he cast them out into a herd of pigs, and they rush down this hill, they stampede, they rush into the lake, and they kind of all drown. And it would have been another amazing thing to witness, that Jesus was demonstrating his authority over demons, not just a demon, over a legion of demons. You know, Jesus has authority over nature, and he has authority over the enemy. I think sometimes it's easy to slip into a way of thinking that perhaps there's some kind of struggle, a power struggle between God and Satan. And yet in Luke chapter 10, Jesus makes it abundantly clear what that struggle looks like when he says, "I saw Satan fall like lightning out of heaven." That's how utterly comprehensive Jesus' power and authority is over Satan. I think that's amazing. And as amazing as this deliverance was to witness for the disciples, it was actually only a kind of partial revelation of what Jesus was going to achieve on the cross. So one of my favorite verses in the Bible is Colossians 2, verse 15. And Paul is talking about what Jesus achieved for us on the cross. And he says in verse 15, "He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him." It's a great verse, isn't it? So in this moment, Jesus was demonstrating his authority over the enemy by delivering this man from a legion of demons. And then on the cross, Jesus demonstrated his complete authority over our greatest enemies by putting them to open shame and triumphing over them on the cross. And then in Psalm 68, verse 18, it says, talking about Jesus, "You ascended on high, leading a host of captives in your train." I think I've shared this before, but I've always kind of pictured that, the picture that conjures in my mind has always been that we are kind of the captives, and we're being led out in victory in this kind of procession train behind Jesus. It's a nice picture, but I think actually a more accurate picture is the picture of a victorious general returning to his city, and behind him is this procession of all of his enemies, great and small, bound and shackled and chained and completely humiliated before the rejoicing people who are watching this procession come through. And I think that's a better picture, if I'm completely honest. I think that's more accurate anyway. That Jesus kind of leads these great enemies, these enemies who once wrought havoc in the lives of his people, fear and guilt and shame, that on the cross, Jesus kind of leads this procession of these great enemies, bound, shackled, put to open shame as he triumphs over them, and as we watch triumphantly. I think it's amazing. I think what an amazing, incredible God we have, such complete authority over the enemy. Jesus has authority over nature, and he has authority over the enemy. And before we move on to the next encounter, I'm conscious that it's worth just noting that, displaying his authority to the disciples wasn't his only purpose in this encounter. Actually, now sat at his feet was a man, a real person who had been completely delivered, completely set free, was clothed and in his right mind. This man who'd been so troubled and distressed and completely written off by the rest of the people, now was clothed and in his right mind at Jesus' feet. And I think it's amazing because actually it seems like that was all Jesus achieved in that trip across the lake. Went through the storm to the other side of the lake. And it seems like that's all he did there, was to heal, to deliver this one man and set him in his right mind. And there's something so amazing about all of these encounters, this kind of contrast between Jesus displaying to his disciples his complete power and authority over all these different situations, and yet his love, his care, his attention for the individuals that he meets along the way. And so, this man was a complete write-off as far as everyone else was concerned. And yet he was so precious and so valuable to Jesus that he went across the lake just to reach that one man and deliver him. Like, what an incredible God we have. He has authority over nature, authority over the enemy, and yet this tender love, care towards that individual, that one man on the other side of the lake that needed help. I think that is amazing. What an incredible God we have. So anyway, back to the account. Jesus kind of goes back across the lake, having delivered this man. And as they return home on the other side of the lake, they're met by a big crowd of people who have been waiting for him to come back. And a man comes called Jairus, who is one of the rulers of the synagogue. And he asks Jesus to come, we've already heard about this, asks Jesus to come to his house and heal his only daughter who is dying. And so Jesus starts to go with the man. And as he's going, the crowds kind of press around him. And we get to verse 43. And it says this, if I can find it. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. And though she had spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her discharge of blood ceased. And Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" And when all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds surround you and are pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out of me." And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she touched him and how she'd been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." And so here we kind of have the third encounter. Jesus is on his way to heal this dying girl. And then this woman who's had a flow of blood for 12 years comes up to him and touches him. And this woman's condition would have meant that she'd been completely separated from the people. She would have been completely isolated from everyone. She would have been seen to be unclean, so that she couldn't take part in worship. She couldn't be part of the community. She was completely isolated. And it was a desperate situation for this woman to be in, made even worse because she'd been like it for 12 years. And so for many of us, the last couple of weeks of isolation have been pretty difficult. Imagine 12 years being completely isolated from everybody else, feeling unclean, feeling unwanted, feeling unable and excluded from being able to come and worship with the people. And in her desperation, she spent the last 12 years spending all of her living, all of her resources, her time, her energy, her money, desperately trying to find somebody that could heal her, somebody that could make her clean, and yet she couldn't find anyone. And then in this moment, as Jesus is walking through, she reaches out and touches him, not even touches him himself. She touches just the fringe of his garment, and in an instant, she's made well. It's amazing, isn't it? It's another amazing miracle to witness, that 12 years of desperation, spending all her money, all her time trying to find healing, and here in a moment, one touch of Jesus, and she's made completely well. And then Jesus kind of calls her out. And again, I've always found this a little bit harsh at first reading. Why couldn't he have just let her slink off, and go home healed and rejoin quietly the rest of the community? But I think actually there are three reasons why Jesus did this, and they are loving reasons why he called her out. And the first is, I think he wanted to confirm to this woman exactly what had happened, that she had been healed, that he had healed her, so that she wouldn't go home and second guess and wonder, was that real? Did that really happen? He wanted her to know that she was healed. It was done, that Jesus had done it. The second reason is that he wanted all of the people to know that she'd been healed. So there was absolutely no question about whether or not this woman could come back into the community. Jesus had made her clean. She was now able to come back in. She could take part in the rest of the community. She could worship again. And he wanted everyone to know that that's what had happened, so that she could rejoin the community. And the last thing I think that he wanted to do is that he wanted to reveal to his disciples that he had authority over sickness. Okay, that after 12 years with no one being able to help this woman, now with one touch, Jesus had made her clean. He had complete authority over sickness. He has authority over nature. He's got authority over the enemy. Here he's showing that he's got authority over sickness. And again, much like the last encounter, it's kind of only a partial revelation of Jesus' authority over sickness, because there was actually a much deeper kind of sickness in the human heart that caused not just a separation from people, but a separation from God. It was this kind of sickness of sin in the human heart. And yet here was Jesus, not just to heal the physically sick, but here to heal this sickness that causes separation from God in the human heart. And so Isaiah 53, really well-known verses, verse 4 and 5 says, "Surely he took our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. And the punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." So on the cross, Jesus took on himself all of our sin and was separated from his Father in our place, so that through faith in him, in Jesus, we can get close to God. It's amazing, isn't it, that through his sacrifice on the cross, he's taken our sin, he's taken that separation, and now we can get close to God. Not in a kind of, we have to come to him with our tail between our legs and kind of slink in the back and hope that really he doesn't notice that we've come into his presence. But Paul says in Ephesians that through Jesus we have boldness and access with confidence through our faith in him. We have boldness and access with confidence through our faith in him. I think this is amazing. Jesus has healed that sickness in our hearts that caused us to have separation from him. And in some ways, it doesn't matter at all what our physical kind of situations are. It doesn't matter how isolated we are physically. We have got boldness and access with confidence through Jesus because of what he's done on the cross, that we have got direct access to God wherever we are. Whatever we're doing, we have access to Jesus. That separation has been completely taken away, completely torn down. He has authority over sickness. And I love verse 48. So if it wasn't enough for Jesus to demonstrate his comprehensive authority over sickness, to heal this woman of her flow of blood, to make her clean, to bring her out of isolation, and to enable her to worship again, in verse 48, he calls her daughter. And I love this. And I wish I could kind of put myself in her shoes, because can you imagine that feeling? 12 years of isolation, 12 years of feeling unclean, of feeling unloved, of feeling separated, excluded. And now here, Jesus has made her clean and he calls her daughter. Jesus calls her daughter. I think that must have absolutely blown her mind completely. 12 years she'd been searching for something. She found it nowhere. And then in this moment, she's found it in Jesus, and he calls her daughter. Yeah, what an amazing God we have. So full of power, so full of authority over nature, over the enemy, over sickness, and yet so gentle and loving and kind towards this woman who'd been so desperate for so long. It makes me want to worship God. And so we move just to the final part of this journey, and Jesus has revealed to his disciples his authority over nature, over the enemy, over sickness, and now finally with Jairus' daughter he reveals his authority over death. And in verse 49 we hear that Jairus' daughter is dead, and yet Jesus, he goes anyway to this man's house. We've heard this already, and he puts out all of the mourners, and he goes to this girl and he tells her simply to arise. And this girl who was dead kind of stands up, and she comes back to life. She obeys his voice. And I find it so interesting, again, that this girl's condition meant that she couldn't even come to Jesus for herself. You know, she was dead. Somebody else had to come to Jesus on her behalf. So her parents came to find him and ask him to come and heal her. And then with one word, Jesus raises this girl from the dead. You know, Jesus has authority over death. And then just like all our other encounters, this actually was only a kind of part revelation of Jesus's authority. So here he raises a physically dead girl, and yet because of his death and resurrection, he has power and authority to raise the spiritually dead. So Ephesians 2 is really clear on the assessment of all human beings apart from God. It says, as for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins. It's interesting that it doesn't say dying, it says dead in your transgressions and sins, you know, unable to do anything for ourselves. And then, but God, in verse 4, who is rich in mercy, because of his great love, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in our transgressions. It's amazing, isn't it? We who were once dead in our sins have now been made alive in Christ because of his death and resurrection. And we're celebrating that particularly today, aren't we? Easter Sunday, you know, that he's taken on the cross, he's taken all our sin onto himself, and he's received the punishment that we deserved, which was death. That was the punishment for sin. He received that punishment, and having taken our sin and having received our punishment, on the third day he rose from the dead, never to die again. And I find that amazing, never to die again. So Revelation 1 verse 18, this is Jesus talking. He says, I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I'm alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys to death and Hades. And then in Acts 2 verse 24, this is Peter speaking to the people. He says, but God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. It was impossible for death to hold Jesus. That's how comprehensive his power and authority is over death. And the implications of that are absolutely huge for us, for those of us who have died with him, who have surrendered our lives to him and given our lives over to him, because we've been raised with him as well and given a new life. So we've been given an abundant life. We've been given a life which is connected to God by his Spirit. And we've been given a life that's so strong that even in the face of physical death, we can say with complete confidence that the words from 1 Corinthians, death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? I think that is it. What an amazing Jesus that we've got. He's got authority over nature. He's got authority over the enemy. He has authority over sickness, and he has authority over death itself. What an incredible Jesus we have, and what an incredible message we've got to give to a dying world, you know, particularly at the moment as we're going through this giant storm, that the one who is in the boat with us is this Jesus. This is the Jesus that's in the boat with us. You know, the disciples, they started this whole journey by asking this question, who then is this? who is in the boat with us during this storm? And Jesus has comprehensively answered that question through this journey and through these different encounters. He is the one with authority over nature. He is the one with authority over the enemy. He's the one with authority over sickness, and he's the one with authority over death. This is the Jesus that's in the boat with us as we go through the storms of our lives. He's the one we can cry to in faith. He's the one that we can be delivered by. He's the one that we can reach out and touch and be made clean and be called sons and daughters. He's the one that can raise the dead. You know, whoever that may be, whether that's our friends or our family or our neighbors that we're interacting with, he's the one with the power to raise the dead. He has authority. And I think we're probably drawing to a close, but I really just wanted to read a psalm just to sum up just what's in my heart, I think. And it's Psalm 46. I'm going to read the whole psalm. It's only short. So it says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. Though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come and behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth. He makes wars to cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. And really that just sums up, I think, for me, what's in my heart, that during this time, during this storm, that we would be just so full of Jesus, so full of that revelation of who he is, of who it is that's in the boat with us during this storm, that we'd be so fixated on the quality of our fortress, that even if the earth gives way and the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, it doesn't matter, because we're in him. We're in that fortress. We're in the one who has all power and all authority given to him. That even if the waters roar and foam, that it's Jesus who's in the boat with us, the one with authority over nature, over the enemy, over sickness, and over death. What an incredible God we have. Yeah. It makes me want to worship him. I wondered, I did mention to Pete, I don't know if it's okay, we've got a little bit of time, I think, if we can just respond by singing. I'd like to sing, Our God is an Awesome God. I think that's kind of the song that's been going round and round in my head as I've been preparing this. Our God is an awesome God, and he reigns from heaven above. And our response to him is to lift our hands in with our hearts abandoned, and we would surrender to him. I think that's a fitting response to hearing about this Jesus that's in the boat with us. So Pete or Richard, I'm going to pass back to one of you, and I'm just going to mute myself.